All rise, we would away. The international residual mechanism for criminal tribunals is now in session. Lorsqu'on mécanisme international appelé à exercer la fonction résiduelle de tribunaux pénaux et ouest. Please be seated.
Good morning to everyone in and around the courtroom. Mr. Registrar, would you please call the case?
Thank you and good morning, Your Honours. This is case MICT-15-96-T. The prosecutor was Mr. Stanišić and Franco Simatović.
And may we have the appearances, please?
Morning, Mr. President. Your Honors, for the prosecution, Douglas Stringer with Grace Harbor and Thomas Logel. Good morning, Your Honors. For Mr. Stanišić, myself, Wayne Jordash, Joe Holmes, and Advat Malvaya.
Thank you.
Good morning, Your Honours. Appearing for Simatović, Melanie Vranješ, Vladimir Petrović, and myself, Mihailo Bakrać. Thank you.
Mr. Jordash?
Thank you, Your Honors. Counsel for the prosecution. Having listened to the prosecutor yesterday and having read the prosecutor's final trial brief, it is plain that the prosecution have abandoned any obligation to respect the presumption of innocence or discharge their burden of proof. Joint criminal enterprise will lapse into guilt by association, as recognised correctly by the Bradjanin Appeals Chamber, if the contours of an alleged common criminal purpose are not properly defined and not found to be supported by the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, the prosecution's strategy is to avoid particularizing as much as possible and thereafter, as their comprehensive disregard of doubt in this case shows, impute responsibility on the basis of a partial reading of the trial record. As the evidence disregarded shows, this is the only way the prosecution can reconcile their allegations with the entirety of the evidence. Gone is any allegiance of the need to give the accused fair notice of the charges. Gone is any reliance upon the common criminal purpose they initially alleged. Gone is any reliance upon the totality of Stanisić's words and deeds, even from their own witnesses. Gone is the Bradjanin Appeals Chamber test that requires a procurement link between Stanišić and his alleged tools. The risk of attributing guilt by association is particularly high in this case, which is unique for one critical reason. The State Security Service had a legitimate purpose for associating with criminals. As Part 1, Section 4 and Annex 1 of our final trial brief discusses, between 1991 and 1995, the DB's job was to process Serbian extremists and criminal gangs who threatened the security of Serbia. As the rules made clear, DB operatives were expected to establish collaboration with such criminals within the country and abroad in order to gain information and intelligence. Hence, the usual inferences of criminality through association with criminals cannot be the basis for a fair assessment of Stanisić's individual responsibility. Instead of acknowledging this trite fact, the prosecution seek to capitalize on it. In their submissions in paragraph 45 and 61 of their final trial brief, where they argue that the DB was uniquely placed to play a pivotal role in furthering the common criminal purpose due to its need to operate secretly, they neglect to mention this critical mandate and how, despite that mandate, their case is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The first part of the strategy is to abandon their own common criminal purpose. As outlined in the prosecution's pre-trial brief at paragraph 31 and 68, and in their opening in 2017, the alleged common criminal purpose was premised on unification of Croatian and Bosnian Serb claimed territories with Serbia. According to the prosecution, Milosevic devised this plan in order to fulfill his ultimate objective of creating a greater Serbia. As seen on slide 2, I'll just wait for that. Not sure what's happening. Let me continue anyway. We can manage without slide 2. I'll read it into the record. As seen on slide 2, and at page 5 to 6 of the prosecution's opening statement on the 13th of June 2017, the prosecution stated, quote, Milosevic's vision was to gather as many Serbs as possible into a single territory that ethnic Serbs could control, what some, like co-JCE member Sešel, called a Greater Serbia. Just below at page 6, they stated, quote, that's what the joint criminal enterprise in this case is about, close quote. At page 48, the prosecution continued their refrain, quote, the JCE's goal of ethnic homogeneity focused on Serb control of and Serb demographic dominance in strategic areas that would eventually link Serb-held areas in Croatia and Bosnia with Serbia, close quote. As slide 3 shows, notably, the prosecution had also proposed as an adjudicated fact, quote, the objective of Serbia, the JNA, and Serb-dominated political parties, primarily the SDS, at this stage was to create a Serb-dominated western extension of Serbia, taking in Serb-dominated portions of Croatia and portions too of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This would then, together with Serbia, its 2 autonomous provinces and Montenegro, form a new and smaller Yugoslavia with a substantially Serb population, close quote. However, this chamber correctly, respectfully, rejected such a proposal as it related, quote, to the acts, conduct, and or mental state of Serbian leaders of which these accused are part. Consequently, we have defended Stanisic's acts, conduct, and or mental state on that basis. Not once in 5 long years did Stanišić indicate expressly or impliedly that he supported this objective. The DB had to protect all civilians in Serbia, whether Croatians, Muslims, Hungarians, and so on, from the extremism and humanitarian crisis that crept towards the Fries shores. Not only in 1995, as suggested yesterday by the prosecution, but throughout. Now, the prosecution want to abandon their common criminal purpose and replace it with another. They claim they were only talking about Sešel. The reason is obvious. As slide 4 shows, in Nielsen's words, the drive for unification was, quote, a story of unrequited love, close quote. All the evidence leads inexorably to this conclusion. Instead, now, the prosecution claim that paragraphs 324 and 325 of their final trial brief that the plan was merely to seize as much territory as possible. According to this latest theory, Milosevic wanted to destroy Yugoslavia so that Croatian and Bosnian Serbs could expand their territory more effectively. course, this latest thesis is completely without precedent at the ICTY. I would also wager it would be impossible to find anyone in the Balkans who would agree that Milosevic wanted to destroy the former Yugoslavia. As argued by the prosecution in all the previous trials, from Milosevic to Karadzic, to Krajisnik, to Mladic, to Plavšić, the Bosnian Serbs' ultimate goal was the unity of all Serbs in a greater Serbia. By abandoning this common criminal purpose, the prosecution hoped to replace evidence of Stanisić's acts, conduct, and/or mental state with the DB's association with criminals. Let me take an emblematic illustration of this strategy: Zvornik. The prosecution has plenty of evidence that Pavlović and other Serbs working in Zvornik saw ethnic cleansing as a means of removing the Drina as a border to achieve unification, but none in relation to Stanišić. Only that the DB, as we explained in Part 1, Section 4, and Part 3, Section 5 of our closing brief, was concerned about the war spilling over from Zvornik into Serbia. So how does the prosecution seek to reconcile these differing aims? According to the prosecution's Zvornik case, as discussed at their paragraph 100, they claim that Pavlović, the brutal TO commander in Zvornik, was working at the behest of Stanišić. As slide 5, not to be shown to the public, shows clearly, and as we discuss in our final brief at paragraphs 1 to 96, Pavlović was being used as a source for information about crimes. I'm just pausing to see what's happening with the slides. Okay. In July 1992, a DB operative reported that Pavlović refused to provide such information, saying that he would send it instead through Djekic. As we explain in paragraph 1316 of our final trial brief, and as the evidence shows, the DB's chief of third administration, the administration tasked with countering extremism, was also using others within Zvornik as sources, including Grujic, the president of the Serbian interim government of Zvornik. And as I've already mentioned, as the evidence shows, in order to record crimes. In other words, the DB had a perfectly legitimate, innocent reason for associating with these criminals. So instead of confronting this evidence of Stanisić's acts in furtherance of a lawful purpose, the prosecution merely ignores it. Worse than that, they ignore every piece of evidence that corroborates. We go into closed session a moment, please, Your Honour.
Closed session.
Back in open session, Your Honours.
So, what is unbecoming, Your Honours? Our call to consider the evidence and obvious frailties and lies, or the prosecution's reliance upon them. Voila. From Stanišić associating with Pavlović in furtherance of security, to Stanišić procuring Pavlović in furtherance of the Bosnian Serbs' common criminal purpose. Of course, the prosecution don't use the word procure. That would demand that they address the entirety of the evidence. Instead, the prosecution's final trial brief contains the word procure 6 times, and never, literally never, with regard to Stanisić's alleged culpable links. The word reliable features even less, only 5 times, and never in relation to their own evidence. As their final trial brief and submission shows, the prosecution much prefers the word association or relationship. In order to highlight the dangers in the prosecution's disregard of the law, we will now discuss more of the dangerous application of the facts and the law. We will then move on to discuss these so-called key associations and relationships to demonstrate how, when considered fairly, even on this reduced basis, the prosecution case must fail. The direct perpetrator ruse. At paragraphs 17 to 51 of our final trial brief, we discuss the red berry ruse and show how the prosecution have sought to avoid the Bradgen and strictures of JCE law. Sadly, the prosecution's final trial brief and submissions have confirmed the worst. The ruse applies not only to the outer contours of the common criminal purpose and the red berets, but to the entirety of Stanisić's acts, conduct, and/or mental state. Yesterday, the prosecution at transcript 14 claimed that Stanišić misunderstands JCE procurement law and labours under the misapprehension that their case is premised on the command of the 3 units. Not so, Your Honour. What we know is that the prosecution have alleged that Stanišić repeatedly deployed 3 units into ethnic cleansing operations. For 4 long years, we've listened to them call evidence of that command. They have alleged that this command is the primary part of Stanisić's significant contribution. Now, at the eve of their case, they want you to ignore that command and convict on the basis of authority only. They know there is no evidence that Stanišić issued a single order to Arkan or even spoke to him throughout 1991 to 1995. The same is true of the Scorpions. The same is true of 1992 and 1993 Red Berets. But rather than admit it, they lapse, as we heard yesterday, into such things as long submissions about the Serbian DB's failure to arrest Arkan under Operation Thompson. Well, sorry, but that which is alleged must be proven. Merely because the prosecution have failed to prove Stanisić's command, or as they would put it, deployment, of the 3 units, his significant contribution now cannot be proven on the basis of some unspecified authority, or on the basis that someone else was in command of the 3 units. That which is alleged must be proven. In this regard, it's instructive to examine the indices that the prosecution claim at paragraph 107, see slide 7, that will help that Your Honours to find that Stanišić should be held responsible for the conduct of every red beret running around the Balkans in 91 to 95. To be fair, it's a rare moment of recognition in the prosecution case that they have a hill to climb. Putting aside the issue of the alleged unit's MUPS ID, which surely tells us very little about command or legitimate authority in the circumstances of this case, we agree that these indices are useful. First, the accused's own words informing the unit that they were the unit's commanders. This assertion can only relate to RFJ 137's evidence, mentioned in paragraph 113 of the prosecution's final trial brief, that Simatović emphasized at Lezimir, quote, only he and Stanišić could issue orders to the unit, close quote. Stanišić didn't claim, and has never claimed, that from spring 1992 to August 1993 he was a commander. The unit members' understanding of the accused as their commanders, including during deployments, and the chain of command through unit commanders who took orders from the accused. Numerous members of the SDG who provided testimony for the prosecution failed to link Stanišić to Arkan. For example, RFJ 011 at P02649 at transcript 8977 to 8978. That he knew nothing about Stanišić, even in 1994 to 1995. RFJ 129 testified that, quote, he did not hear anything about Stanišić. That's at page 33 of his testimony on the 3rd of July 2018. The same is true of the Red Berets. None of the so-called veteran commanders held Stanišić out as their commander. Not Dragon's Red Berets, not Vucevic's Red Berets, none of the Bosnian Red Berets in 1992 or 1993, none of the paramilitaries in the 1992 report 1D00067. The evidence just isn't there. Third, the colloquial names for their group, whether Frankie's men, Red Berets, Kaninjas or Grey Wolves. The indices speak for themselves. Not a single Red Beret group identified as Jovic's men or Stanisić's men. As judges experienced in military culture, you will appreciate the significance of that. Fourth, the claim that the unit's uniforms with the Serbian sword and the unit Grey Wolf insignia, the same insignia found, they say, on Simatovic's uniform. To begin with, the prosecution only mentions so-called unit members wearing this uniform in Paisos, Bosanski Samac and Dubois. More instructively, the Grey Wolf and sword insignia, as confirmed by RJS 12, were very common emblems across the Balkans at that time. His report confirms that after the disbandment of the unit, ex-members, quote, continued doing dirty jobs using the uniform and insignia of the Red Berets, close quote. RFJ 137 confirmed that he continued to wear his despite retaining no association with the DB after the nascent unit. And what about the nascent unit's internal stamps, or the internal stamps of the so-called Red Berets across the conflict? As Your Honours will see on slide 8, not to be shown to the public, the prosecution claim at paragraphs 120, as well as yesterday, that proof of Stanisić's command over every Red Beret in Croatia and Bosnia comes from the consistency of the stamp. Characteristically, the prosecution neglect to mention, let alone argue, that all the stamps used after the disbandment of the nascent unit in spring of 1992 are different to the official stamp of the nascent unit used by Ivanović on the 11th of November 1991. Fifth, the unit's privileged status as manifested in their impunity vis-à-vis local police and their ability to cross borders freely. And yet, where is the evidence of this? As discussed in paragraph 1443 of our final trial brief, in 1993, when Mijović ran into trouble trying to cross the border into Serbia, Who did he request to call? Stanišić? Commander for the last 2 years? No. Minister Sokolović. When the group of Red Berets were arrested in Bosnia by Davidovic, did they call upon Stanišić? No. As a June 1992 DB agent's report 1D00747 records, when the police confiscated Arkan's contraband, who did he call? Stanišić? No. Badger? Yes. Sixth, the documentation the accused maintained on the unit as reflected in the unit members' personnel files and pay lists. As shown in Annex 7 of our final trial brief, the personnel files contain various biographical claims to have been a member of a group or a unit. But interestingly, none show an express link to Stanišić or a formal link to the DB. Curious that even in confidential DB documentation, none report answering to Stanišić. As for the per diems, they begin no earlier than August 1993, consistent with the JATD creation. How convenient, the prosecution says. Well, not really. Highly inconvenient, actually. Much was made yesterday concerning the SDB's alleged concealment of 1D00067's the report from 1992. What the prosecution don't mention is that Stanišić was entitled, pursuant to the rules about work of the State Security Service at Article 69, you'll find that at P006, page 18, to have destroyed this, and the per diems, and the personnel files. What they also don't mention, as we outline in our final trial brief at paragraphs 121 to 128, is the fact that the per diems reflected an informal system of payments used for a wide variety of purposes, including reimbursing public security members, staff engaged temporarily to perform specific functions, like VJ pilots, family members of those who had been killed, cooks, cleaners, janitors, carpenters, and so on, and people who had started training even if they hadn't completed or were not taken on. Instead of focus on this type of detail, the prosecution have used the per diem list to ambush the accused. The prosecution's allegation in Annex E2 that the DB paid 60 SDG members from September to October 1995 is a case in point. We have repeatedly asked the prosecution to disclose their case pertaining to Arkan's men in 1995. What were their names? How many did they number? How many did the DB allegedly pay? Deafening silence until now. Now, when we cannot do anything about it. And worse than that, the prosecution reaches that number 60 by a misreading of the evidence. Slide 9, not to be shown to the public, presents a particularly egregious example of this. They select names from a witness's diary, P03158, that have not been identified as SDG members. Voila. Here's 60 names. They're all Arkan, and you can't do anything about it. As slide 10, not to be shown to the public, shows, it is not only the outer contours of the case that shifts under our feet. As discussed at paragraphs 25 to 29 of our final trial brief, the 28 elite Red Berets, quote, mainly used to train volunteers at 29 named training camps, has now gone. The 8 core men in the prosecution's pre-trial brief has morphed into 17 core unit or veteran commanders in their final trial brief, no longer focused mainly on training but now mainly military deployments. Moreover, this strategy applies across the whole case. Instead of procurement, the prosecution Annex A lists 92 individuals, 55 alleged to be members of the unit, with who the accused are said to have a, quote, significant relationship. Annex D provides a list of 228 personnel files, and Annex E1 lists 131 individuals on the per diem lists. And so the ground is set for circumventing the strictures of JCE law. Not procurement, only significant relationships. Not notice, but accusations in their final trial brief. And what Your Honours are supposed to do is pick and mix from this partial consideration of the evidence. Look at Djurković at Annex A, paragraph 35, who the accused are said to have a significant relationship with. Why? Because he was mentioned on an intelligence report, P01651, that was labelled, quote, forward to Frankie, and purportedly distributed to Stanišić. It mentioned only that Djurković led the Exchange State Commission that moved Muslim families out of Bayalina. Significant relationships swamping the trial record at the close of the case will not help Your Honours apply JCE law, especially when the prosecution refused to engage with obvious reasonable doubt. Now I'd like to focus on the prosecution's failure to prove Stanisić's contribution. We will focus on the prosecution's claim that Stanišić made a significant contribution, and since the prosecution are keen on relationships, this is where our attention will focus. Throughout their brief, the prosecution attempt to prove that, in their words at paragraph 939, that, quote, from 1991 to 1995, Stanišić was considered Milosevic's right-hand man, close quote. They place him throughout their case in a uniquely critical political and military role. At paragraph 896 and 897, as examples only, they say he was involved in, quote, forming, training, financing, and or providing logistical support and other substantial assistance, including weapons, to Serb forces in Krajina, SPWS, and Bosnia. The scale of the allegations is remarkable. What is crystal clear from that scale is that Mr. Stanišić must have been engaged in constant action, constant courses of conduct. So even if the prosecution are right, Stanišić was able to act covertly, one would still expect clear and unequivocal evidence of his relationships with alleged JCE members and his participation with them in crimes. Regardless of whether you'd expect it, criminal trials demand it. And this is where the prosecutor's case begins to crumble. There remains a material mismatch between the JCE allegations condemning Stanišić as one of the chief architects and implementers and his actual relationships with JCE members and tools alike. In sum, notwithstanding the crimes by others in Croatia and Bosnia, if the prosecution cannot establish relevant and probative relationships with Martic, Hadzic, Arkan, the Scorpions, the unit, Kostic, Kojic, and other so-called DB assets, Karadzic, Mladic, Micio, Stanisić, their case must fail. These are the bare minimum required, surely, to have done what they allege he has done. So let's have a look at Croatia before turning to Bosnia. A useful point when looking at relationships is to examine Stanisić's own area of expertise, intelligence gathering. At paragraph 58, the prosecution claimed that the, quote, accused received information to influence events in Serb-claimed territories in furtherance of the CCP. How do they know that the information was used in furtherance of the CCP? How do they know it was not used in furtherance of Serbia's security or peace efforts? They don't. The prosecution ignores the fact that the evidence shows unequivocally that Stanišić did not use intelligence to support Martic and Babic. As the evidence shows, and as we argue at paragraph 420 of our final trial brief, Martic and Babic disbanded the Krajina DB in June 1992 because Olović, Martic's chief of state security, was sending information to Stanišić and bypassing Martic. Prosecution cannot simply ignore this evidence. It demonstrates a relationship of mistrust and antagonism that sits completely at odds with the prosecution's overall case, that whilst simultaneously being rejected by the RSK leaders in this critical area of support, Stanišić was apparently lending them assistance in every other conceivable way. Why, if Stanišić was helping Martic and Babic through inter alia creating the Krajina and SPWS police, supporting the Krajina TO and the SPWS TO, deploying Arkan, Red Berets, Scorpions to support them, would they reject him, mistrust him? Seems a bit churlish, to say the least. The prosecution tries to mask over these antagonistic relationships by relying upon wild allegations of untrammeled power and two demonstrably flawed theories, Babic's parallel structure theory and Vasilievich's Vonya Linia in the SPWS. They are designed to do nothing more than replace real evidence of relationships acting in pursuance of a common criminal purpose with nothing more than hot air. According to the prosecution, paragraph 7, 117 and 203 and to 205, the parallel structure in the Krajina circumvented the local leaders and enabled Milosevic, through Stanišić, to control the political and military structures and hence to determine policy, make key appointments and establish Serb forces, all in furtherance of the common criminal purpose. According to one of Babic's versions, it began in August 1990, establishing the conditions of an efficient CCP. According to the prosecution, it involved Bogdanović, Dragan, Filipović, Martic, Olović, Arkan, and local officials such as Zečević, president of Benkovac, from November 1991 to February 1992. The Vonya Linia was equally busy. According to paragraph 197 to 199 of the prosecution's final trial brief, the Vonya Linia included, first and foremost, Stanišić, of course, who, on behalf of Milosevic, coordinated Simatović, Badja, Kurtes, Bogdanović, Filipović, Tabavčević, Arkan, JNA generals Bjočević, Ivanović, Panic, and Andrulović.
Could you please slow down?
To transform the JNA and coordinate with them various paramilitaries, including Arkan. Granted Stanišić authority over Kurtes, Bogdanović, the SPWS TO, and so on and so forth. Who needs proof of actual relationships when you have a parallel structure and a Vonya Linia? The problem is, of course, twofold, to say the least. First, as slide 11, not to be shown to the public, shows, and as Janachkovic and Bogdanovic's creation of a treason commission and Nielsen confirm, the MUPS Serbia's chain of command was functioning normally in 1991. Stanišić.
Could you kindly slow down for the interpreters? Thank you very much.
Jordash,
Sorry,
again, the interpreters.
Stanishic's ability to work was severely hampered. Janachkovic was holding things up and Stanishic's hands were tied. So, not that Stanišić was completely absent from work, but that he was not in a de facto position to play the role alleged. The second problem is, of course, worse than that. The theories are illogical and consist of wild assertions devoid of real support. As we explain in paragraph 355 to 357 and paragraph 485 of our final trial brief, they rest on the evidence of Babić and Vasiljević. RFJ 084 heard Vasiljević's claims and adopted it. Putting aside the fact that Vasiljević retracted his von Linie claims in their entirety, his original thesis rested on one essential premise, as discussed in Part 2, Section 4b of our brief, and conceded by RFJ 017 and RFJ 84, that between 1990 and June of 1992, Milosevic did not control the JNA High Command. In other words, Stanišić was required, through his relationships with individual JNA commanders on the ground in SBWS, MOP officials and paramilitaries in SBWS, to ensure that Milosevic controlled the crimes. However, this essential premise is directly contradicted by Babić's parallel structure thesis. As he explained at T13129 of P01246, Milosevic did control the JNA through control of the SFRY presidency and the SSNO. So no Stanišić needed for the parallel structure in the Krajina, essential for the one in the SBWS. Both cannot be true, Your Honours. Either Stanisić's evil hand was needed at the ground level to coerce the JNA, or it wasn't. A closer examination of both theories is instructive. As we explain at paragraphs 485 to 510 of our brief, Vasiljević's original thesis failed to allege anything more than Stanišić attending meetings with certain JNA generals. He couldn't substantiate the claims about what happened in the meetings. RFJ 084's account was even more devoid of detail, although you wouldn't know it from the prosecution's final trial brief. He conceded that he literally had no knowledge of Stanisić's alleged relationship to Badger, Bogdanović, Vasiljević, Bosković, Biocević, Obradović, Stojanović, Volucic, and Curtis, despite alleging that Stanišić led these men in the Vonja Linia. As for Babić, even the very premise of his theory is ridiculous. Babić and the SDS in Croatia were moderates, and Belgrade overcame their reluctance. Nobody outside the prosecution accepts that as a valid interpretation of Babić. The evidence in this case shows otherwise. According to Babić at P01246, page 210 to 211, quote, police units or volunteer units, I'll paraphrase, would engage in provocative shootings to provoke the other side, upon which the JNA would join in and hence ethnic cleansing operations were furthered. But let's have a look at that. Despite claiming that the DB was in control of all the events in the SAO Krajina from 91 to 95, he confirmed that the only names he knew from the DB were Stanišić, Simatović, Captain Dragon, and Feature. As for the imaginary operatives in the field and the agents, he had no clue. Babić's evidence lacks any detail of Stanisić's acts, and we urge Your Honour to read his testimony carefully. According to Babić, from June 1991, the DB had, quote, an overall control of all events at the time in Krajina, close quote. No details, no corroboration. And Your Honours will have noticed the contradiction. Babić claims at P01246 T13490 to 13491 that the DB formed parallel structures from August 1990. Later, at transcript 13545, he claims it was April or May of 1991. Both cannot be true. Neither are true. Despite the implication of scores of relationships with paramilitaries, Babić was unable to name any units under the control of the parallel structure, except Vajakic, the commander of the 7th Banya Division, at P01246, transcript 13383. And even he was only subordinated to the imaginary parallel structure until September 1991, that is, when the JNA became involved, and when we say the common criminal purpose began. On Martic, Babic variously claimed at P01247, T3582, that, quote, he had true power, this is Martic, and also the structure that protected him, Stanišić and Milosevic, and they practically kept him under their control, close quote. And yet soon after, at P01248, T1525, he claimed that the relationship between Martic and Stanišić was, quote, quite friendly. They cooperated closely, and Martic listened to what Stanišić had to say. It wasn't any sort of formal subordination, but rather taking advice from a senior colleague. It didn't involve any sort of obedience, closed quote. As for Hadzic, what did Babic have to say? He was under Stanisić's authority. Why? Quote, because Stanišić would accompany him sometimes to the presidency of Serbia, and people even said that he stayed in Stanisić's apartment, and that he slept there when he came to Belgrade, and he was completely under Stanisić's complete control. That's the evidence. It's assertion. It's not actually evidence. And as for military operations that the DB engaged in, the evidence was equally as lacking in substantiation. When at P01248 T1394, Babic was asked who controlled the volunteer units in Krajina between January and August 1991, his answer, under the control of the police, or rather the parallel structure of state security. No detail, just assertion. Typical response from Babic. Take Plivice. When asked at P01246 T13114 whether MUP Serbia personnel was involved in the events in Plivice, his answer was typical. Quote, they knew about these preparations. Now how far they themselves took part in it and organized it, I can't really say. I don't know. However, at P1246 T13117 to 13118, Babic confirmed, quote, before the events of Plivice took place, Jovica Stanišić came to Knin, Frank Simatović came, Ficha, Captain Dragon and several others. I don't remember their names, close quote. According to Babic, P01248, T1417 to 1418, and T1807 to 1808, Stanišić controlled Martic and the SAO Krajina through the Krajina DB. And this is what prompted Babic to disband the Krajina DB. Not a single document or witness confirms this. And it's demonstrably absurd.
Counsel is speaking very, very fast.
Requiring you to slow down?
I will. Plainly, as confirmed by OFS 15 on the 26th of November, page 17 to 21, and 27th of November, page 23 to 27, 2019, and confirmed by Krajina DB and Federal DB reports, P01426 and P01795, and also Nielsen, paragraph 346 of his report. The service was improvised, amateur, and repeatedly criticised for lacking professionalism and competence. There were no DB operatives, so Olovic took over. As I mentioned already, it was disbanded in June of 1992, not because it was an instrument for Stanisić's command, but Martic felt Olovic was not sending him the same information as he was sending to Stanišić. The reality is that the prosecution's vonlinear and parallel structures are nothing more than a device to replace real evidence of acts and conduct and mental state with wild assertions. and is particularly designed to do one thing, which is to take evidence of Stanisić's presence and a iota of evidence of his activity in the Krajina, which ends in August of 1991, and turn it into activity in pursuance of a common criminal purpose. As the Martic judgment found, at paragraph 443, and as the evidence in this case shows, this is when the common criminal purpose in the Krajina started, and the prosecution have a problem. Stanišić disappears in August of 1991. Look at the prosecution's claims in paragraphs 358, 359 and 404 of their brief, alleging, without evidence, that Stanišić planned and coordinated all war operations in Krajina and SPWS between October and December 1991 by controlling the Krajina MUP through the parallel structure and through Badger and other SMUP forces deployed in SPWS. Of course, it's nonsense, and this is why the prosecution have to play with the evidence. Slide 12 is an example, not to be shown to the public, of that manipulation. True, RFJ 130 did say, initially, that the MUP coordinated all major activities carried out by the SAO Krajina MUP between October and December 1991, as the prosecution alleged yesterday and at paragraph 358 of their brief. But as the prosecution know, that's not all that witness said. When challenged on his claim, he admitted it was an assumption. As he stated, quote, no, I wasn't the one who could have such information. I was not involved in all that, closed brackets. If you have to cut and paste evidence to make your case, it's because you don't have one. The prosecution's reliance on assertion reaches its nadir when similarly insisting at paragraph 359 of their final trial brief that Simatović coordinated 5,000 men in the Krajina in 1991, based only upon the vainglorious nonsense of the Kula Award speech. As Babic's parallel structure thesis and Vasiljevic's Vonja Linja thesis shows, it's not good law to rely upon assertions. They don't discharge the burden of proof. They don't respect the principle of culpability. Even taking the prosecution's case at its highest, as the prosecution are determined to do, the evidence does not disclose that Stanišić was working with Martic or Hadzic when the war operations began and the common criminal purpose started. This is also, just as an aside, why the prosecution attempts to argue an impossibility in their submissions. Stanišić was contributing apparently to a common criminal purpose in 1990 and early 1991 that in fact did not exist even on their case until spring of 1991. That's an impossibility. If the agreement doesn't exist, there can be no contribution to it, surely. Let's focus in a bit more on the relationships. Now we've dealt with the Vonja Linja and parallel structure. Martic. Prosecution assert that Stanišić was Martic's superior, his, quote, first and only commander, paragraphs 223 and 224 and 226. In the end, such wild assertions rely only upon Babic and RFJ 066. Two other witnesses, RFJ 144 and RFJ 017, who testified similarly, both referred to the post-Vance period. Their evidence stands in stark contrast to both the documentary evidence and witness evidence. That shows that Martic regarded Stanišić as procuring Kojic and Kostic, not to help him, but to harass him at the border of Serbia. Slide 13, not to be shown to the public, shows part of a furious call Martic made to Milosevic to complain about this alleged assault. As for earlier, at paragraph 327 and 329 of their brief, the prosecution attempts to construct a connection between Martic and Stanišić by relying on RFJ 066 assertions that the two met frequently in Belgrade and that Stanišić provided Martic cash.
Private session.